Just like
Just before we begin, I would one note for the panelists, because normally we're all used to having cameras so people can see. The audience doesn't necessarily know who's speaking. So before you answer a question, if you could just announce your names just so the people know who's talking. What I'm going to do is what I'd like to do is rather than introduce each of the panelists by name, why don't we just, we'll start going right to left. If you could introduce yourselves, and then just take a couple minutes. I'm not to state your position, just who your organization is, so that we all know who you represent and things like that. So with that, Patricia, if you want to start.
Sure.
And welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us.
Hi, thank you for having me. I'm Pat Stanton. I'm with Conservation Services Group, and many of you may know us as a residential energy efficiency implementer. But I'm here today representing our Clean Energy Markets division, where we represent distributed generation, solar, combined heat and power, and in and energy efficiency in the forward capacity market in New England. So that's the perspective I bring today.
I'm Jackson Morris. I'm Director of Eastern Energy with the Natural Resources Defense Council. I've represented the environmental parties in the NYSO governance process since 2009, and I'll leave it at that so we can get right down to business.
Good afternoon. Welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. I'm Jim Holodak. We're representing National Grid and the other investor-owned utilities in New York State. National Grid is, as you may know, is an international electric distribution transmission generation company. So we have a lot of interest both in New York and New England on how these markets interact, as well as representing the utilities.
We've also been asked to ask people to speak closely to the microphone so your eager hordes of audience can...
I'm John Reese with U.S. Power Generating Company. We own about 2,000 megawatts, 15% of New York City's generating capacity. I'm the incoming chairman of IPNI, but I'm sure most of their members would say that I don't speak for them.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. My name is Kevin Lang. I'm here on behalf of the City of New York. Welcome to our city today. We appreciate you being here, and today we are speaking on behalf of consumers.
Scott Harbian with FTI Consulting. I have an ongoing consulting relationship with the New York ISO and was involved with the TOs in forming the transition from the New York Power to the New York ISO. I also have an ongoing relationship with the Midwest ISO. I'm a member of the California Market Surveillance Committee, and I'm appearing, not representing anybody here today, I'm appearing at the invitation of FERC and New York Public Service Commission staff.
Great. Well, thank you. And as we did in the morning, and I thought that actually worked quite well. We're going to, each of us will have some questions. We'd like this as much as possible to be a dialogue, interaction, things like that. So, and you know, to me, this morning we heard about sort of the focused on the changes in the potential changes in the capacity market, about attracting investment. This afternoon, I really would like the focus to start moving to how are we going to create this appropriate interface between what we're trying to do at the state level around public policy and how and what we should be doing to affect the markets so that we maintain robust markets, but that we can make certain that there are market mechanisms that allow us to achieve public policy goals. And so with that, you know, one of the challenges that I see in the market is that there are you know, the need to protect reliability, et cetera, doesn't necessarily accommodate some of our interests at the state level around renewables, around demand management, around sending the right price signals so we can promote efficiency. And I would be kind of interested in the panelists' thoughts about what type of changes can you envision in the market so that we can use market mechanisms to enable clean energy better, to enable efficiency better, things like that. And I'm mindful we're not moving into the 745, but I'm more talking about just as sort of generically, what would you like to recommend and sort of things that we should be thinking about. So I'll throw it open. Pat, if you want to start.
Sure. Thank you. This is right down my alley. We represent our customers in a number of markets, including capacity market, and I believe that the multiple markets, for example, the trifecta for my clients is if you can get renewable credits because you use a renewable fuel source, combined heat and power because you have a combined heat and power installation, so you get combined heat and power credits, and then you also are in the forward capacity market. So you're getting 3 additional revenue streams for meeting the goals of 3 different public policies. And while it seems challenging, I think it's cleaner than trying to roll those things all into a single market mechanism. With that having been said, you do have to take into account, when can solar be there and that kind of thing, and make sure that that's appropriately accounted for. I will say that when there's skin in the game, when small behind-the-meter generators or energy efficiency has skin in the game, we step up. We step up in terms of better metering, better quality metering. We step up in terms of scheduling maintenance so that it isn't not the wrong time of day from the perspective of the grid operators, and providing good data so that the picture of what's going on is clearer. So I do think that there's a real benefit, even if we're really little and we don't make a whole lot of money, there's a lot of benefit to the system as a whole to have these types of resources in the game.
This is Kevin. I'll jump in here. One of the concerns that we see is there can be a tension between public policy considerations and economic considerations. Renewables may not necessarily be able to compete, and certainly not just on the market revenues. I mean, right now we have RPS, which was talked about this morning, and there are contracts that are associated with that. And it ties into looking specifically at the capacity markets, the issue of buyer-side mitigation. We can't have a situation where we're making investments for public policy purposes, but those are then excluded from the markets because of mitigation or because of a contract, and then we have to buy the capacity twice from an incumbent. The buyer-side mitigation rules, when they were first designed, were intended simply to protect against market power. They were never intended to be a tool to protect incumbency and to allow incumbents to continue to maintain their revenue streams. And as we move forward, and I would submit that these issues aren't just at the state and local level. If we look at what the EPA is doing with their greenhouse gas rules, it's at the federal level as well. And we have to figure out a way to harmonize these public policies with the capacity markets. And one way is to ensure that all resources are recognized in the market and are able to compete against each other, and that we're not doing things that are simply protecting those entrants that are already in the markets. In fact, if we go back to the 1990s, the whole reason at both the New York State level and at the federal level we moved to competition was this idea that new technologies and more efficient plants were going to come in and take the place of older plants. And if we look in New York City, right now we have many plants that are 50, sometimes 60 years old. And the markets are, to a certain extent, stifling new development. If you look in New York City, with the exception of Bayonne, most of the plants that have come in with contracts, because there aren't real market signals there to say, I'm going to go make $1 billion or $1.5 billion of investment. So we need to harmonize the idea that investors need long-term certainty, and we certainly understand that. But they're not necessarily going to get it, whether it's a 1-year or a 3-year signal, and that we need to figure out a way to harmonize the contractual relationships along with the market signals to allow everything to work together. And the other thing I just wanted to note along the same vein, there was some conversation this morning about the Lower Hudson Valley Capacity Zone, and look what came back. What came back? A 50-year-old coal plant that's being converted to gas, but it's still a 50-year-old plant. And NRG recently announced they were going to bring back Bowline, which is 30 or 40 years old. Our market shouldn't be about preserving old plants and bringing back old plants. It should be about encouraging new plants, whether it's solar, whether it's wind, whether it's super efficient combined cycle units. That's what we need to be designing as we move forward.
Well, to get back to your question.
Sorry, Tom.
And we promised to poke each other.
Well, keep us all away.
That's right. So, you know, at the end, a lot of it is about the cost. The cost for the ratepayer at the end, who, one way or another, is paying for all of this. New York's been very good historically in integrating public policy initiatives into the wholesale market over the last 10 years. The RPS is arguably the lowest cost per megawatt RPS in the country. It is one of the minimal impact RPSs that developers who have to develop the renewable projects are in the market to get, based on capacity and energy revenues, for a substantial portion of their financing and developing the project. And the state policy portion takes care of the part you couldn't do in the marketplace, that the wholesale market doesn't recognize. We have the RGGI project program, which started in New York, which is, in my view, sort of the best example of a public policy effort that recognizes lower emitting units in a way that uses the market structure. It's in our price. I don't get dispatched if I'm an older, less efficient unit. It is a way to accomplish for the ratepayer an optimized, lowest cost energy price and recognize emissions. And so as you look forward in REV, which I think is visionary, I think creating a construct that allows technology to develop and preserves the necessary infrastructure is absolutely essential. I think, look at the national recognition of this effort. But I think you need to be mindful in the implementation of the components of REV at the distribution level is that people are still paying. And whether, and if it's a subsidized level at the distribution level that causes wholesale market prices to go down beyond below the cost of production, units are going to go away. The reason that we have, as Kevin pointed out, a whole lot of old generation coming back. We brought 180 megawatts back in New York City that will be available online next summer. We did it without a contract. We did it on a merchant basis because capacity price reached a level that we could fix the unit. The reason, we have two development projects. One to build 100 megawatts, another 400 megawatts. We have to be ready to do that, but there isn't that price signal that says bring in $1 billion project. It's a price signal that says repair the older, less efficient units.
I just want to touch on a couple. I am going to answer the question, but also I just want to touch on something that Commissioner Brown mentioned when he said that we've learned to live with RPSs in 37 states. I think we've also learned to live longer as a result of those RPSs because of the air quality benefits those have driven. These zero fuel cost resources have had huge benefits in the markets where they've been able to participate effectively. So to echo Kevin's point, from NRDC's perspective, a blanket exemption for renewable projects is kind of a no-brainer. And to the NYSO's defense, over the past couple of years through the governance process, they have worked very hard to bring together kind of a package approach to addressing various exemptions that stakeholders in the governance process have highlighted. I think to some extent maybe peeling out this renewables exemption may be a way to move more quickly on a piece that we see should be put in place sooner than later. And for the reasons Kevin mentioned on renewables, you're going to have consumers paying for resources that advance public policy and then not benefiting from that capacity in the market. And so, and then the other piece I want to touch on is the RGGI price that was mentioned this morning when we were discussing the idea of, well, if we have that externality incorporated into prices, doesn't that mitigate the need for a public policy standalone program? Couple of things. I think RGGI is a model for the country to pursue and consider as they look at options to comply with the Clean Power Plan. I'd also point out that we're looking at $5 a ton right now. The social cost of carbon is 5 to 10 times that number. We're looking at a $10 price potentially in the latter part of this decade. So it's, while a step in the right direction, it by no means is fully internalizing the environmental impacts of the power sector. We're moving in that direction, but we're not there yet. And until we are, we absolutely need these fundamental complementary policies such as an RPS, such as an EEPS, and we need to make sure that the consumers in the state of New York who are funding those programs are also reaping the benefits in the market. And the most perfect example of that is the fact that on the list that Emily had this morning of the resources that participate in the capacity market in New York, glaringly omitted from that is energy efficiency. It is not able to bid into the capacity market in New York, and right now that is a value, it is a market failure that is not compensated. So I think that's just another discrete example of, if we're not going to compensate that resource for its value on the wholesale markets, then maybe we need to pursue a way to reflect its value through a retail tariff. But it can't be nothing. It's got to be compensated somewhere.
Let me just follow up on that, and I know there are other questions here. I mean, is one of the fundamental purposes of markets, at least as I always saw it, is when we went to this construct and we had independent market operators, we didn't have folks who had an economic interest in retaining the status quo, looking at things. And as we know in this industry, the everybody wants in, then they become the status quo, and so they're the resistant for other folks coming in who might upset their potential market model. And the value of independent markets is they should be independent of that pull and really always looking at driving efficiency and driving towards better use of assets. So to your point, John, is if in fact you have the ability to use load better, so that you're not procuring in the wholesale market. That's an economic value, and whether you value that at the retail level or value it at the wholesale level, shouldn't we be driving towards market designs that allow for, if you send a market signal and consumers respond as opposed to just investors responding, the markets need to accommodate that. And we shouldn't see that as a market failure or market problem. It's actually showing that the markets are working. We have the demand side and the supply side working, and so the challenge then is how do we make certain that the supply side actually accommodates where the demand side is moving?
I think from the utilities point of view, I think we fully support REV, and it's got a couple of directives, right? One is to help drive retail markets. The other one is to improve capacity utilization, as you were just saying. If you look at the way the markets were designed originally, they were really all about resource adequacy, reliability, and the lowest cost, and they didn't necessarily accommodate fuel diversity or renewables. To the extent that we want to price in attributes into those markets for those very things, that's a great thing. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism to do that now. There doesn't seem to be a mechanism to say, if I need firm fuel for gas generators, I can't necessarily get it. The paradigm of the difference between the way gas pipelines are built versus electric generation and transmission is built, it's a wide disparity. Pipelines won't build unless they've got 15, 20, 25-year contracts where the generator's not sure what he's going to need on a day-to-day basis, right? So there has to be some improvement in the capacity, energy, ancillary markets, whatever one of those three or all three that you want to put those kind of cost benefits in to help drive that. And then the last issue is just that DER, there's a very good place in the markets for DG and DR. To the extent that it moves out of the wholesale markets and into the retail markets is fine, as long as we still can recognize that capacity, the benefits of that. For DER, that's not really, to me, it's not demand response. It's really serving load. It's just serving load at a different place. So to the extent that you price attributes in for renewables, no low carbon, whatever, you should have the same pricing signals at the retail level as we do on the wholesale level. Otherwise, you may drive inefficiencies where you're trying to drive efficiencies.
Scott, I guess I know you haven't had a chance to speak.
No, that's fine. I tend to agree with Pat's comments at the beginning that we should try to keep the capacity market incentives separate from the others. If you think about a goal of emissions reduction, that really has to do with energy output, not capacity. You can have a resource that operates a couple of years a year that provides capacity, but emission reductions means reducing energy output, not capacity. And you can, even in the thinking about things like delivery rules for capacity. When you're talking about capacity on peak, you're saying, do we have the ability to deliver this resource on peak? When you're talking about reducing carbon emissions, you're talking about, can you back down the other unit off peak? And you can use the same capacity. So I think we want to keep them separate. And I agree with the gentleman, sorry, I don't know your first name, from the National Resource Defense Council, that, yeah, the incentives aren't strong enough in the energy market, but we want to, it would be better to put those resources in the energy market and have them apply symmetrically to all resources, as opposed to, some of the things we see happening, looking at other places as well, where sometimes we end up with a zero-emission resource going out of business replaced with gas and some somewhat, low-emission resources. So, giving subsidies to one particular resource, you got to remember it's going to push back in other places. So it's better to, within the extent you can, align the incentives with your goals.
I think we need to be careful that as we move forward in time, we're talking about markets that exist today. And let's just go back for a second. What we started with was vertically integrated utilities. They did distribution, transmission, and generation. And in the 90s, we said, we're going to split out the generation, and we're going to make that competitive, and we're going to open up transmission so anyone can use the transmission system. But it was still the same structure: generation, transmission, distribution. Looking at what we're doing in the REV, which is really recognizing what's going on very generically or organically in the world today, is that the whole structure of electric supply and electric delivery is changing. We have microgrids. We have CHP facilities that you can build that can serve 3 or 4 buildings in New York City particularly, or in any dense area. You have folks that are putting solar panels and backyard wind, and there's all sorts of technologies that we don't yet know about. There's fuel cells that can serve your facility or maybe could serve 5 or 6 facilities. And that traditional 100-year-old structure of generation, transmission, and distribution, as we move through time, is probably going to become far more blurred than it has been. There was some conversation, I think Gavin had mentioned this morning, about regulators being careful not to pick winners and losers. I actually do agree with that, that in our view, the purpose of regulation should be to ensure a level playing field, a fair and equitable playing field, and to be monitoring costs. But it shouldn't be stifling innovation. I'm not suggesting that either the FERC or the PSC are doing that. I don't think they are. But as we go forward, and to some extent you have to look at the difference between the short term and the long term, we need to take steps in the short term that allow this innovation to prosper, what the Public Service Commission is looking at in the REV, and looking at all these different paradigms. And it might be 7 years, 10 years from now, we're not going to have the same traditional energy and capacity ancillary service markets that exist today. They might be a part of it, but there might be a whole set of other markets as well because of the other ways that folks are getting electricity. So we just need to be careful as we're going forward, that as we're acknowledging the need for public policy, we're also acknowledging the changes in technology and making sure that we put procedures and rules in place that allow those to grow and prosper, not that they're inhibited.
I think Kevin actually makes a good point. As I look at this, this is not a revolution. This is an evolution. This is going to take, over the last 5 years, 40% of the demand response has left the New York capacity market. They received a price signal that exceeded the capacity price by a factor of 2 in some of the networks. It's not just about money. It's about reliability, and it's about the technology that can serve the services that we need, both in the marketplace and for the consumer. And I think what REV does is it opens the door for the consumer part of this equation in a way that we haven't had before, to have information, to be able to control their own resources, to do it on a local level. But at least in my view, and maybe I'm jaded, this is going to take time, and it's going to take technology evolution. And my concern is what I don't want to see on either side is sort of a radical rush to bright lines. And that is very consistent with what Kevin said, and I had to say at least one thing that was very consistent.
And I'll just one follow-up on that, and then I'll hand over the gavel. On that, I mean, there's the issue, as you say, and I think we would all agree that government shouldn't be picking technologies. In fact, what REV is trying to do is move away from government picking technologies, but instead providing the market an element to allow innovation and animation and consumer choice to actually occur. But by the same token, and I've seen this in markets, and is that as new technologies come on and they can meet the needs of the system, of meeting instantaneous demand, moving to the millisecond. Different types of technologies will have different attributes and capabilities. And I think and I was just interested in your response to that, just as we need to guard against, I would think, regulation looking like it's driving towards a particular solution, I think it's also important to make sure that the markets are accommodating the attributes of different types of resources. So that if we have a resource like a storage, which could be very effective in providing reactive power and quick responding, but they're restricted from entering into the market because they have to supposedly perform for 4 to 6 hours. Isn't that as sort of the same type of barrier that we're trying to destroy and limit everywhere else? And how do we make sure that just as you're saying, it's an evolution, that the evolution can occur at the pace it wants to occur, as opposed to being impeded because we're trying to sort of hold on to the past?
Yeah, I would agree on that. John is right that we've had a lot of reduction in demand response, but when you dig down into it, it's not just a price issue, it's also the rules. And one of the biggest reasons why demand response has dropped off is because of the very restrictive rules that they have to meet. And I absolutely agree with you that when you look at these new technologies, they're going to need different sets of rules, and it shouldn't be getting down to the real nitty-gritty. I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about safe and adequate service and just and reasonable rates. It's about system reliability. It's about keeping the lights on. But once we've done that, we should be careful in how much we're imposing on the rules. Now, I recognize from the NYSERDA's perspective and from the utilities perspective, it makes it far more complicated to operate the system. But somehow we're going to have to figure out how to get there and do it in the least restrictive way possible.
I would like to second that, and also say, having taken a number of new technologies through both either ISO rulemaking or state rulemaking, I think a real commitment to seriously sitting down and looking at new technologies and using the comparable rule as sort of a touchstone to say that it isn't the same technology, so it doesn't need the same rule, but it should be comparable in terms of the service and in terms of the, how it will benefit the system. And I think if you do that, and if you make that commitment to having an open door for each technology to come in and sit down and say, yeah, but I only work when the sun is out, so how do we deal with that? I think that we can, for energy efficiency, if peak load is a big issue, then energy efficiency can and should step up on time of day savings. If we have skin in the game, it's easier to do that.
I guess from our perspective, completely agree with the comments, and Audrey, with your observation that there's attributes that are very important to policymakers. Again, it could be fuel diversity, renewables, low, no carbon. I think what we're thinking is that we support, as utilities, we support exemptions for wind and renewables to a large extent. I think without having those attributes priced into the market, it's very hard for those generators to get built. We're fairly opposed to long-term power purchase agreements that give those developers, a long-term certainty as far as their revenues, because the more you go into power purchase agreements, the further you get away from market characteristics. But in order to get those done, the markets right now don't work for those types of generators. So it's important that we get paid, or that the generators get paid for those attributes. It's also important, I think, that we recognize fuel diversity. With the low shale gas prices, I think the United States has become nearly fuel independent, finally. And the last thing we want to do is to shut down that resource and not make it available to either gas LDCs or to gas generators. But the pricing mechanisms need to be there to help those generators recover the cost of whatever type of firming contracts they need. And the last thing I'll say is just that, if the markets can be fuel agnostic, they can be technology agnostic, but they should also be market agnostic. So to the extent that renewables on a very large scale are or aren't more efficient than distributed energy resources on a small retail scale, we just need to make sure that we strike the right balance there so that customers aren't paying a lot more potentially for distributed resources versus large-scale resources. So as long as you price the attributes the same and you let the competitive markets work, you can reach your state renewable goals, I think.
I would just like to put in a word for tradable credit markets at the retail or distribution level that are specific to specific public policy objectives, such as combined heat and power, or solar, or the advantage of the tradable credit markets in those areas is it really allows a lot of small players to get involved, and there's a clear vehicle for how they can monetize the attribute that they're bringing to the market or bringing to the grid, and sets up an administrative process that makes it easy to get a lot of mass market type of players involved.
I want to say something, and then I will try to get around to a question that I'll try to keep as clear as I can. Speaking for myself, I have a great affinity for a lot of the environmental programs that have been talked about. I ran first-generation conservation programs, planned them and ran them for 4 years at the old late great Nice. With all due respect, John, the first R in Reggie stands for regional in New England. Didn't think it was designed in New York. In multiple states together, and I worked on the first generation renewable portfolio standards. So these are all good efforts. Now that I'm at FERC, I have the responsibility to oversee the wholesale markets. And the idea of a market is that you set up a structure and the market selects the resource by some criteria that are impartial in the market, whether it's picking the next thing to run every 5 minutes, whether it's picking what to buy next 6 months, next year, next 3 years, is run by the market. And it's, no matter how worthy the programs are, directly in tension with or at odds with a regulator or anyone else saying, I'll have so much of this and so much of that and so much of this, is directly in tension with the idea of a market. And I want to just say one thing, which is we've bounced around the buyer side MOPR rules and all morning. The purpose of the MOPR rules is not to protect incumbency. A market, by definition, is supposed to be open to all comers. It's to make sure that when the market uses its mechanisms to set that price, it gets the right price because all the things are in there and the price is being set. I want to parse, like at a deeper level, if we could, why it is that when we try to take and we'll say renewables because we want to stay away from demand response, and price it into the wholesale markets, why it needs exceptions. And I heard a few themes, but I want to ask the panelists to comment. One is economically it needs subsidies because it can't compete. Even though we heard zero fuel cost, I know conservation can be cheaper than generation, but there might be some that need subsidies because of where they are in their lifespan. So if they had to go in and set a price equal, they couldn't compete because of economic subsidies. That gets to carbon pricing, which could be set up. It doesn't have to be at the RGGI price. When you have your own state implementation plan on 111D, I mean, that's a way to set it, but it gets to pricing. If the subsidy is wrong, that's one thing. The second is somehow the scale is different, that you can't take a lot of little solar rooftops and compete it against a combined cycle plant, and the scale is off, and somehow we need to do that. A third is that somehow there's a structural difference, because this one thing is retail and one thing is wholesale, and 111D, it's the state versus the region. Is it all about subsidies, or what is the reason for the tension? Because if we don't know, if we can figure out why the programs are not going to work in the markets, then we can figure out, if we can, at least what you would do with least damage to the market. If it's all at the distribution level and it's just seen, and the market just sees it as a demand curve, then you can do everything at the distribution level and it shouldn't have a market imperfection. But it's when you start saying we need this exception to this rule, and the fourth one I wrote down was if there's a specific market rule, like, hey, when you say it has to run so many hours, that messes us up. I think we'll all say, I feel like I've spent the last 4 years doing case after case to break down those barriers. Storage isn't working for this reason, we'll change this rule or that. If there's more we missed, we need to know what those rules are. But if it's like it needs a different price, why? And then, because if you don't know the answer, you can't solve it. So that's what I want to hear. What are the problems? Why we're having this meeting? What are the tensions?
Well, as I have a position of about 20 megawatts of demand side resources, distributed generation, solar, combined heat and power. It's about 100 individual assets that have been aggregated into that 20 megawatts. And from the perspective of the capacity market, I think it's best that the capacity market, that we play on a level playing field. We get the same price.
So that's
totally
structural.
Structurally, totally. Now, those resources may also get state credits through retail other markets, which is great. But I'm not looking for any exceptions, and certainly energy efficiency has played exactly on a level playing field in New England.
But if you were a generator and you were getting credits, you'd have to deduct them somehow, right? But you want to keep the credits and get the market price too?
Yeah, the credit is a completely different market. It's a different currency, so to speak. And that way I get 3 different currency streams if I'm renewable and I'm a combined heat and power and I do the capacity market, but they're 3 separate markets.
So you're talking about in New England, efficiency bids into the capacity.
Yes.
Right. But if in fact we did it just the converse, which is that if you reduce demand, right, so you're procuring less as a load-serving entity, as long as the economic signal is the same, it ends up having the same effect.
You can pay it out of distribution rates if you want.
Right. Right.
So let's just going, Chairwoman, just to your specific question of the capacity market is not based on a competitive price. It's based on an administrative construct. And that administrative construct is in downstate New York a dual fuel gas facility, and in upstate New York a single fuel gas facility. That's not indicative of the cost of building a hydro. It's not indicative of the cost of building solar. It's not indicative of the cost of building wind. So you're getting a price signal, but it's not the price signal to build all of these other facilities. The city right now is building, looking at, well, we've actually gotten licensed, we're building a hydroelectric facility in the Catskill Mountains. And I've been very involved in that process, and we've looked at the economics of it. No private entity would ever build that plant because the price signals just aren't there. The city is doing it because it has a very important public policy purpose, a green power purpose, and we can also afford to recover the costs over a very long period of time that a private entrant can't do. And it's in part because of the pricing of the markets isn't reflective of the cost of these other technologies.
But wasn't the market set up that way? The concept, I thought, was that it's trying to use economics to choose resources, and that was assumed to be the marginal unit, so that would be the proxy. And you're saying you don't want that assumption anymore because you don't want that.
I'm not saying
they didn't just make that up like everything has to be like gas. Wasn't there some, now
Sure.
I'm over my skis, but there was some reason gas was chosen because it was going to be on the margin.
Right, absolutely. But renewables aren't necessarily on the margin. I mean, wind is blowing overnight and wind might be there on that peak day, but it might not. If there's no wind, then the wind facility isn't blowing. If you have very cloudy days, the efficiency of your solar is way down. The market and that market price was designed not based on renewables and not based on public policy. It was based on least cost economics.
Well, I mean,
You want those resources for a reason other than
Least
they're the
cost
cheapest way to meet the customers.
Absolutely, and that's so going to your question of why do we need these exemptions and why do we need these other rules, it's because there is an incompatibility between why you would do renewables versus purely least cost economics. Con Edison in a PSC filing came up with some information very recently on the cost of different technologies, and some of them are orders of magnitude higher than the cost of a gas plant.
So why not just go back to IRM,
Sorry, Bob.
go back to IRM and say we're going to do so much of this, so much of that, we're New York, this is what we want, and then just do an RFP for however much gas you want or whatever.
It comes back to what is the function of the capacity market. And the reason that there's a gas-fired dual-fuel unit, perhaps incorrectly designed, that sets the cost of new entry price is it is the lowest cost in the wholesale market for delivering that product, the capacity product. And it sort of comes to the core of all these discussions is what is the capacity market? If the capacity market is about reliability and supplying electricity, then that isn't where you make these changes. Because you end up with hundreds and hundreds of adjustments. My set of rules that I live under today compared to when Con Ed owned the plants I owned 30 years ago is exponentially larger. And if we're going to make them, again, exponentially larger, we're not going to have efficiencies in the market, whether it's the public policy objective or the reliability objective. And so I guess from my view, the place to, and perhaps separate from a lot of the members of my sector, I'm a strong supporter of demand response in the wholesale market. I won't talk about the case, but I believe it is integral to the functioning of a wholesale market. I think somebody just died in the back.
I think Gavin just...
He might have. But you, I mean, I whether it comes to the ISO or it comes to Con Ed that is going to be responsible for integrating the public policies into their operation, they're going to have to deal with reliability at the end.
So John, and I just want to, so my point is that the capacity market is to procure the resource required to maintain, to keep reliability, adequacy, I would say, more than reliability. But the point is that, and that's where I understand where Kevin was going, there are other public policy objectives beyond that that may not be within what FERC would look at as to a well-designed wholesale market, but the state has a desire to do based on our obligation of meeting economic interests and environmental interests, as well as with 111D, now some federal obligations as well. And so the point is not necessarily that we need to fix the markets in order to enable that, but that how do we make certain that the markets themselves are not the barrier to that implementation and adding more cost on because of a design that's based on sort of whatever in terms of avoiding uneconomic purchases, and instead is actually preventing us from meeting our public policy goals. And
I would say, and vice versa.
Right.
How do we make sure all the public policy goals
right.
don't so strip the value
Right.
out of the market that then when you say, hey, now we're going to use the markets because we ran out of something, they don't really work anymore because so much has come out of them, in which case you can just re-regulate. I mean, but if you kind of try to have a market and you take so much out. If you said, I want to have a 200 kilowatt solar goal in New York, I think most people would say, well, that's noise in the whole many gigawatt capacity market. But if it gets to be that it's so big, some of these things, that it could really affect the market, where do they hurt each
Right.
other,
And,
not
and
just
so,
one, yeah.
and this is great. We'll talk to you guys. in a few minutes.
We're glad we could facilitate you guys speaking. It's, you know.
Do you want to say something?
No, and I'll hand it, but
I think we know what this show is really about.
But no, I just want to be clear, because from New York's perspective, where we're headed is not necessarily saying we want 200 megawatts of solar and 100 megawatts of storage and 300 megawatts of wind, and that'll be a gorgeous stew. What we want to say is we want to reduce our carbon footprint, and we want to do it in the least cost way possible. And what we need to do, and that's what I keep getting back to, is to make sure that the wholesale markets, as we move, is that if in fact there's a value, for example, around storage, and we want to move to the millisecond of dispatch, because that really values storage, which when you built the markets around slow-moving generators, that didn't make a lot of sense, but makes a lot of sense for these types of resources. Or if we want to move towards recognizing efficiency, because we see this as a goal, is not to necessarily pick the solution, but make sure that the market design rules are not thinking about yesterday's technology, but are enabling tomorrow's technology.
And I would just add one piece to that, is that as we do implement those, the consumers aren't paying twice.
Right.
That we're paying for those, and then because of the market rules, we have to pay for normal gas-fired or some other type of fired generation in the market, because the market refuses to recognize all of these other resources.
Right. And
I just, again, I want to thank the New York Commission and our staff for putting this together. It's been a good discussion. I'll watch the rest of it on the webcast, and I'm sure we will be discussing many of these items for the foreseeable future.
So, just real quick, I wanted to just echo what Kevin just said. I mean, I think at the end of the day, to take your specific question on renewables, and so why does it need a special exemption? So, right. So, I mean, I think it's just to take it out of the weeds where we all live way too often. I mean, I think really if you're going to explain to your mother-in-law that you're paying into a public policy platform that's going to advance zero emissions resources in New York State with the RPS. We've also got this market that actually is, and those megawatts are real, and they have a capacity value to you and to your system. But because of the rules we're going to set up in our market, those aren't going to count. And I just think at the end of the day, the Federal Power Act is a consumer statute, and if you can try and make that case to a consumer that I'm going to pay for a resource that is advancing a public policy and not also see the value it provides to the market reflected in the market, that's why the renewables exemption is just, again, just take it way out of the weeds. I mean, that's the end of the day. How can you make the case that that makes sense? And on the efficiency side, to Chairman Zillman's question, I think on the efficiency side, yes, you can skin the cat a lot of different ways to reflect the value of that resource. But to your question about, well, do you want to get credits over here or this subsidy or this revenue stream and participate in the market? If the market is working, that's not double counting. That's compensating the value that resource is providing to the system. And right now, that's not the same as the load forecast being lower the next year, because that's socializing it. There's a time lag, and the person who made a $5 million investment with some subsidies into their commercial building and reduce load and reduce the capacity obligation of a load-serving entity is not receiving that compensation. And also, I won't go as far as to say efficiency can provide black start capability, but not yet. But I mean, you know, to flip it around, if I'm a generator and I'm providing black start capability, you better be sure I get paid for that. And right now, efficiency is not receiving the capacity payment that it provides to the system in New York.
But if you're a renewable generator and you get a subsidy and you're also bidding in the capacity market, and somebody else is bidding in the capacity market and not getting a subsidy, but they're bidding in a price and you're bidding in a price, then if the capacity market is an auction for the value of a megawatt hour, it's not a fair market. If there's something else you're also auctioning at the same time, then you have to honestly price that in. I mean, yes, okay.
I'd like to respectfully disagree. I think that the capacity market is for capacity, and if a renewable provides X amount of capacity comparable, a megawatt hour is a megawatt hour is a megawatt hour. if they're
I
getting...
agree. That's why if you're getting $8 here and $2 there, then you get $10 altogether, just like the gas plant gets $10. I mean, that's what a MOPR is. But I'm sorry.
Okay.
No, I think that the renewable attribute that you're getting your subsidy for is a special attribute. It's not energy, it's not capacity, it's the environmental and fuel diversity benefit that society is paying for. It's completely different than either energy or capacity.
So your point is that, as I understand it, this is a separate market.
It's a separate market.
And the fact that there's a separate market that the state has created for public policy purposes that are not within the Federal Power Act but are under the state law should not be discredited in a wholesale market, but is the fact that there's another payment stream is just a fact of life.
Right.
But it still impacts a market. I mean, it skews a market.
Right, and then and sort of there lies the rub, right?
Right.
Because the FERC has the obligation to run a wholesale market, but the selection and the determination of resources becomes a state issue, and if it's mitigated, then what's happening is that there's a federal intrusion into the state objectives, and so how to accommodate both becomes the challenge.
Let's
Wow,
be clear.
I really
Can I
don't
take a
want to
turn?
leave now.
Before Phil
How does it
leaves,
skew the market?
I didn't get a chance to disagree with Phil yet today, so here's my opportunity. If the state of New Jersey provides tax credit and income tax incentives for the widget manufacturer, the widget manufacturer doesn't have to change his price on the market
Exactly.
to reflect that. He just has a competitive advantage because the state decided for whatever public policy, economic development reasons to give that incentive. You could make the same analogy with renewables. The state wants renewables for all the reasons that were articulated, and they shouldn't be punished in the market because of that. They should be treated equally in the market because of that. Now you can go, Phil.
But that's the point behind the MOPR, not punishing, it's leveling.
I think there's a little confusion here because the capacity market values the capacity value of the resources, Pat and other people said. And it's based on the costs of a gas plant and the revenues of a gas plant. But a solar unit has different costs. It also has different revenues. And we don't mitigate based on those other revenues. It's got other revenues. And it gets emission, it doesn't have emission costs. And it gets RPS values. And that isn't a subsidy. That's just part of the market. The thing is, but if you tell the story that even with the RPS costs and even with the zero, emissions and even with everything else, your plant is still hopelessly uneconomic, I mean, there's something wrong there. But, the idea is, and you can say, well, it's because the emission, we should have a $50 CO2 price, and that's a point. But that should be in the RPS standard or whatever, so it flows through. But we aren't going to mitigate somebody saying, oh, you can't get the RPS value, and because that's not, a gas plant doesn't have that. It has fuel costs and it has different, everything's different. So I mean, I think these things can be combined. And, in terms of the value of resources, again, I think that put these things in the energy market. It becomes very, very difficult to, as you move to the REV and as we get more renewables in New York, and they have to deal with the flexibility issues that California and the MISO do, and that's very, very hard to put into a capacity market for the kind of things about how do you deal with flexibility, 4 hours versus 3 hours, a hydro unit that can run in these conditions and that conditions. But if you put those incentives in the energy market, which New York actually does, they're the best in terms of the generators actually see the consequences of the 5-minute price. We have shortage pricing with the regulation, and if you see spikes when we have a temporary imbalance and there's a rational signal going out. So there are strong incentives for for those kind of resources with flexible attributes to come in. So I think it does fit together. And for the RE division, the ISO is putting out a 5-minute price, and if you put that 5-minute price out in real time to consumers, they'll be able to respond to it.
I just want to respond to something Gary said, and it might sound heretical. We don't have an obligation to run a wholesale market. We have an obligation to run a wholesale market that's just and reasonable if there is one. If this is a single state ISO, you could vertically reintegrate, use the NYSO is the world's best dispatch center, and buy whatever you want. But if we run a wholesale market, then we have an obligation to keep it fair. So, I mean, we're not forcing the market on anyone. That was a choice that was not made at FERC, I don't think.
Could we move to...
Now Steve probably passed out.
Could we move to PJM or New England instead?
Just like one example I wanted to, speaking of PJM, I think the one example that we see as kind of a massive overcorrection and a kind of overreaction to the polar vortex situation is the PJM capacity performance proposal, going back to avoiding barriers to innovation and barriers to the resources. We're moving towards a more nimble and flexible system where we need fast ramping capacity, we need more renewable energy, more distributed resources. That proposal is a step 2 decades back because of the rules that it sets up. We understand the need to maintain reliability, but we just think that proposal is a great example of going too far and having very negative consequences on the resource mix that'll come out of that if it is approved. And then one point that goes back also to the coordination issue, and it's a much longer conversation than today, but on the planning side of this, as we enter into the REV future here in New York, one concern that we have that is going to be really important to hammer out is, from a system planning perspective, making sure that this proliferation of distributed resources are quote-unquote visible to the ISO. With New York Sun, we're going to see 3,000 to 3,500 megawatts of behind-the-meter solar by 2023. Under the REV, we're going to see potentially thousands of megawatts of distributed resources. And if the NYSO and through the RNA process can't see those resources and can't count on those resources, we're going to have a grossly overbuilt system that's ridiculously redundant, way too expensive, and also more polluting than it otherwise would be if we coordinated those processes very carefully.
So are there two ways to see those resources? I mean, one way would be for the ISO to see everything. The other way would be to give the LSE the opportunity to really dispatch load in and have the commitment around load. So in that instance, it takes the obligation to essentially manage those resources away from the ISO, places it on the distribution utility, who now has the responsibility to meet whatever their dispatch schedule is. It's sort of active load management as opposed to reactive. But in either way, the thought is that somebody has to have the responsibility to say, this is what the instantaneous load is, and have a vehicle to pay the penalties if folks don't respond. So I'm not suggesting distribution utilities are going to take the risk, but they do need to be, someone needs to dispatch those.
Right. And I guess to that point, it's really a market within a market that you're talking about, right? But to my earlier points, the price signals have to be consistent between those two markets. Otherwise, you're not going to get an efficient market. The capacity and energy markets weren't designed to pay for those kind of attributes that are now wanting to be valued. So it's a market, but it's not necessarily delivering the right products, right? So to the extent we could calculate, probably years until we can agree on what kind of pricing you use for those types of attributes. Right. But to the extent that you can and you build them into the market, whether it's wholesale or retail, as long as there's a consistency between the two, you may get to the best answer.
And that, I think that the consistency issue is perhaps the one argument that I would put on the table for having these resources be seen in the capacity market at the ISO level, because you have a lot of different distribution companies in New York, and the consistency of the data and the consistency of the rigor of EM&V and all of that has real value, and having everybody having that visible, I think, is perhaps the strongest argument for it being the capacity component of that all being in one place.
I would just urge that this conversation just reinforces the point that as we move forward through time, there's going to be a very significant blurring of what is really wholesale and what is really retail. And I think that this kind of a forum with both commissions talking to each other directly and through us and directly between you is exceedingly important, because there aren't going to be clear, bright lines between what exactly is FERC jurisdictional and PSC jurisdictional, and what is actually in the capacity market versus some utility construct versus the energy market, or some market that we don't yet know exists but will be creating in a couple of years. But what's most important is that there's harmony between state and federal regulation. This morning there was a lot of discussion of the need for stability and clarity. And as we go through time, and whether it's from a consumer perspective, a generator perspective, a utility perspective, a DER perspective, everybody that participates needs to understand what those rules of the road are, that there can't be whipsawed between federal and state regulation. And it just becomes exceedingly important. Maybe, yes, we always like to take credit for everything in New York, but the fact that we are a single state ISO gives us the opportunity to do a test bed for some of these things to see what works and doesn't work, that maybe they can apply in other regions, maybe not, but it gives us this opportunity to try to figure out how to harmonize the two so that we're creating something that everybody that wants to participate in these different designs can be tried out without one set of regulators saying, well, we don't like that design, so we're not going to let that one go forward.
I kind of feel like I should move closer to my chair to help protect her. I'm kind of way out here on the, I don't know whether it's the right coast or the left coast, but I'm out here. And okay, and I will. Yeah. And you know, I'm kind of reminded of my days as a law professor. Sue Dean Kelly knows that I once taught at the University of New Mexico Law School. Some of you might not know that otherwise, but I used to teach first-year students, and one of the things you do with first-year students is you torment them with really difficult hypotheticals. And they're really game about the first 5 or 6 weeks of the semester. You know, the hands will go up, they'll try to answer the hypothetical, and you throw more facts at them, and it drives them to an ever more extreme position. And finally, they realize that they can't win, and there's really only one right answer when the professor asks the hypothetical, and that is, it depends. And here we're having, I think, a very kind of complex discussion involving some novel questions under the Federal Power Act. And I think it's just very hard to answer in the abstract. For example, I'm assuming the hypothetical rests on the assumption that whatever the costs are for this renewables unit, that they would be mitigated under certain rules, and the capacity price would have to go. But who knows if that's true, right? Who knows if this facility could take advantage of PURPA, for example, where it would be receiving the avoided cost that the utility would otherwise have to incur. So I mean, there are a whole bunch of things. I don't know whether, for example, the state could enter into long-term power purchase agreement with that facility that provides it with the financial support it uses so that it exercises its authority under state law while avoiding any potential federal questions. So I just raise that point to say that we can kind of engage in this discussion, but I think it's an important discussion to have, and actually I think that's one of the most important things about this afternoon's session, that we're having this conversation about tough issues and having a frank exchange of views. But I would also caution people from jumping to any conclusions about what the outcome might be under federal law. To me, there are a number of questions. One is, you know, what can FERC do under federal law? And we're certainly, you know, hearing the concerns raised by any number of people here today, both those who would like there to be some recognition of public policy. I think there are some other individuals here representing different interests who maybe have some concerns about what it could do to the market and the like. I respect that too. They're difficult questions, and so the question is, what can we do under federal law? The other question would be, you know, what's good policy, both at the federal level and at the state level? And given the constraints of federal law and state law, what's the best path forward? But again, I think in terms of getting to that point, having this discussion is a great starting point. And now I'm going to move over next to the chairman.
I have actually another question that maybe relates to this, but to kind of get folks thinking about it. Let's just, and I will offer a hypothetical, but you know, one of the things which we've been struggling with, and I've been struggling to try to answer, is this. You know, part and parcel of one of our concerns moving forward is, as we move towards a much more gas intensive environment, how do we maintain fuel diversity? And, as we all know, that one of the things that renewable energy, and in this context I'm not talking about hydro, which is obviously renewable energy, but solar and wind, is it's non-dispatchable. But it has occurred to us that if you could structure agreements where there's a value in reducing the amount of volatility by using a gas-based resource paired with a dispatchable resource, so that from the market standpoint it's fully deliverable, can we develop market rules that are purely economic, that value the fact that you have some resources that are zero fuel, and they could be used in combination with other resources if we had a market design that could create that, incent that type of pairing and that type of structuring. And that's been something that's sort of befuddled me in how we can do that. And is it around, and I'll just, things like increasing the capacity factor for solar and wind if it's paired by a resource and it can demonstrate it's dispatchable. So does that solve some of the problems that we're thinking about? I'll throw that out, and you guys can tell me if I'm nuts, but it's just...
I think that figuring what you want in terms of service, or and then putting that out in the market, particularly in, I think, storage and other technologies are just on the cusp, and if there's a clearly defined way of defining what it is you would like the renewables to accomplish, that the technologies are out there.
So does that, and this is where I'm sort of struggling, is that the market has always looked at resources as individual resources, right? A generator needs to meet this, this capacity, this requirement. But it's never really looked at, well, how about if you have pairings of resources? Can they come in as a group? And in that context, can we value that as a group as opposed to each individual resource?
So it's almost kind of taking the concept of, at the distributed level, you might have a diverse demand-side management portfolio that involves some storage, it maybe involves some PV, it maybe has some CHP, and that bundled resources aggregated and then active in the market as a portfolio, but kind of taking that to a wholesale utility scale level. Don't have the answer. It sounds really intriguing, but the one thing that would give me pause is that depending on how you structured that, if it had the unintended consequence of leaving the market outcome that for some reason solar or wind on its own is not a viable resource, that would be one unintended consequence that that would give me pause, so that you would want to recognize the fact that that might be a new product that could be bundled, but it by no means implies that other intermittent resources on their own don't provide value to the system and couldn't still participate.
I mean, this one seems to me to be more of a definitional thing that, it might be Arizona, but I'll say it's New Mexico because I'm sitting next to Norman. There's solar paired with molten salt storage that almost behaves like baseload. You have nuclear plants next to pump storage all over the place. The thought of having things paired to bid somehow does not seem on the face of it to create the issues we were talking about in the last conversation with what if people get different revenue streams and all. I mean, it's a definitional, and we have microgrids, like the Princeton University microgrid has a little bit of solar, couple of different cogens, a big and a small, a bunch of customer side of the meter demand stuff, and they bid into PJM with all that stuff. So, I mean, it's going to require definition, but this one doesn't seem to me to be like a big structural thing at odds with the market by definition. But
and I just would say two examples. One is we have aggregation resources where we get lots of little things, but to ISO New England we look like one thing.
Right.
And the other is we in one of our assets where we have solar, we have to partner with a winter resource. So we actually do a joint bid. with a winter resource. I mean, it's not as complicated as you're talking about. We're not as sophisticated technology, but it's the concept of pairing is something that we're already living with.
Yeah, and I think from a capacity utilization, we haven't discussed it here today, but there have been proposals to bring hydropower down and balance it with wind. So if you're going to build transmission infrastructure, at least you increase the capacity utilization of that transmission line. Doing something like this in the retail market, I mean, it makes sense. The concept makes sense to me. It's a question of how you do it. So the technology for storage isn't yet mature. So that's a very expensive technology at this point. So if you take an expensive solar technology, which is high capacity cost but free energy cost, right? And you combine that with an expensive storage solution, you get a very expensive solution that might be balanced, but it's really expensive. So until those technologies mature, you have to see how that goes.
As the owner of existing dual fuel units, I think it's a great idea. If I owned one of New York's nuclear facilities, I might not feel that way as a resource that is available, doesn't see the kind of shortages we see in gas and oil, has certainly no air emissions to mention. So I think definition is the issue, how you define it and how you incorporate at least the opportunity.
I was just going to add that to a certain extent, I think and some folks have already said it, I don't think the technology is there yet, but we're getting there. Right now, the premise of your comment or your question was that solar and wind aren't dispatchable, and that's true today. But 2-3 years from now, that might not be true anymore, because when you tie it, if you look at what Solar City and Tesla are doing in matching batteries with solar, you can potentially, if we get the technology there at some point, and we're not there yet, you can make these facilities dispatchable facilities. Now, are you going to get them to the same level of one of John's facilities? Probably not. But if you have a disaggregated system, that in and of itself is probably how we're going to get to fuel diversity in this state. I mean, one of the benefits that we've had over New England and some other areas is we traditionally have had tremendous fuel diversity here. And thank God for our large hydro facilities, our wind facilities. But we've benefited from that. We're not as subject as New England certainly was to some of the vagaries of the gas markets. I mean, we are, but we're getting there. And it's another example where you can't just look at the wholesale solution. You have to look at the entirety of the industry. And you might not get 500 megawatts of a solar facility in one place. But as Jackson said, you're going to get 3,000 megawatts of solar across the state. It's going to have the same ultimate effect on providing that balance and that fuel diversity. And when you get it with a battery storage that is cost effective, and it's not there yet, but when it does get there, and I think it will be, then it's going to be able to compete, and you're going to not have those same concerns about being so reliant on the gas system.
I think, well, bundling sounds good. I actually think it might discourage the other resources, because it ties them to a particular resource they're bundled with, as opposed to just having it in the spot market, and they're good. The storage resource gets the storage value, and the solar resource gets its solar value, and the difference between the New York and New England method of handling demand resources, you don't have to bundle. If you're a winter resource, you clear in the winter, and if you're a summer resource, you clear in the summer, and you don't have to mix and match with somebody and be dependent. But we have to make sure we get the capacity value for the storage resource right, so that if it gets the capacity value and another resource is good at providing energy, and when you think about gas, remember that's energy. If we have wind blowing in the winter, that's backing down gas. Even if it isn't every hour, it's backing down gas consumption over the day.
I guess what my question was, Scott, is that, it doesn't have to be mandatory, but let's say I think we offer solar as like a 17% capacity factor in the New York ISO, and somebody said, well, hey, I can, or whatever it is, 20%. Whatever it is, if I can increase it by 30%, and because I'm pairing it with some load response or other types of resources, economically now that's of value to me. What I'm looking for is not necessarily an obligation, but a price signal, and saying if this becomes dispatchable, it's more valuable to the market because now we know it's going to be there, just like an E4. If you're highly valuable, you have a higher E4 rate than if you're not of value, or not available. So I think it's just a matter of allowing innovation and making sure that the market doesn't keep market players from saying, well, here's another product we can offer, we meet your needs, please don't label us as solar and therefore we're stuck in the solar box if we look a lot more like a dispatchable resource.
I think we need to be a little careful when we're talking about the price signals, we're talking about administrative involvement. And when you look at solar, for example, at least on the retail level, I don't live far from a Home Depot. And there is now, and I don't know which company it is, but there's a company that has a table set up as soon as you walk in the door, sign up here to buy solar. And it's becoming so prolific, and it's becoming its own competitive market. There's a number of players out there. They're making a big push with media. You don't necessarily need regulatory intervention when you have an actual competitive market taking over.
Now, be clear, I'm not looking for regulatory intervention. I'm looking to eliminate market barriers that may exist because of just the market rules. I'm not favoring any resource. I just think that we need to be flexible enough to suggest to a resource, if you want to get a higher capacity factor, here's what you need to do. Go out and if you can prove it, prove it. We're ready to accommodate that.
Chair Zibelman, I would like to address this if I could.
Yes.
I think that this is a great question because it really ties into the opportunity between the energy markets and the capacity markets. So thus far, from the NYSO's perspective, we have included wind and bulk solar within the energy market. They certainly have a great opportunity to make inframarginal revenues because they're free from a fuel perspective. And your question really is if there are innovations in technology where they have a greater opportunity to take advantage of the capacity market revenues, is that something that could be accommodated? I think the fact that we have rules that accommodate intermittence in our capacity market today is an example of how in New York we have tried to accommodate different resources. So what you're describing certainly is not an insurmountable problem to pursue. When the technology is there, I think we've had a history of showing that we figure out how to take advantage of that value.
I'll get off it. Does anyone further?
Yeah, I
Yes.
have a question. Since we're talking about markets, and that's been the topic of conversation, and this conference is about markets and infrastructure, I think I'd like to ask our utility panelist what are his thoughts on fixing the gas infrastructure? Do you have thoughts on that, on how you would like to fix it?
Everyone's leaning
So,
back.
there's a few issues which I spoke about before, that the paradigm of getting something built between the two markets is extremely different, right? Generally, gas pipelines don't want to build anything unless they've got long-term contracts for 15 or 20 years with credit-worthy counterparts. We've done some work in New England. National Grid is not the other joint utilities in New York. But we've done some work and have some proposals out there where the electric distribution company might take on that capacity contract with a gas pipeline to get that infrastructure built, as long as that electric distribution company can then release that capacity to the generators on an equivalent basis or on a fair basis first. Let the generators bid for that capacity on the pipeline so they can firm up their fuel, and then whatever capacity is not utilized, you release on the secondary market as any LDC does today when it procures capacity for its LDC. So without that kind of a construct, especially in the Northeast, it's very difficult for a pipeline to be willing to come in and build that infrastructure. There are other areas of the country where they will do that, and there are other areas of the country where you get producer push, so the producers are taking the bet and paying that capacity cost, that it can deliver the gas into the markets and recover those costs. The problem in the Northeast, especially in New England, and it may become a problem in New York, depending on how many renewables we add and how you can balance those. If we can't do it with storage, electric storage, or something else, first thing that comes to mind is gas peakers, right? So between generation retirements and new infrastructure for renewables, we may actually be seeing a large increase in gas dependency in New York. Again, the only way to do that, because it's a peaking problem and it's not a base load problem, generators generally don't want to buy firm fuel because they can't recover those costs in the marketplace. So without an attribute in the markets to give them that, it becomes a question of who else can step in to take on that capacity contract with the pipeline. We, as the EDC in New England, have proposed that with Northeast Utilities and UIL. It's a question then of whether or not whatever capacity is not recovered in the marketplace, whether or not the electric distribution company can collect those costs from the retail customer. So you could look at it as an LDC procuring more than enough capacity to satisfy the gas LDC as well as the electric generation. But the reliability issue here is really on the electric market. It's not on the gas market. So it's a question of fairness. Should the electric customer pay for that contract, whatever shortfall there is, to satisfy the EDC? And as the EDC, we're willing to kind of step up and put our credit and our balance sheet at risk because we haven't seen any other way to get it done up to this point. On the other hand, we don't want to insert ourselves and then take a huge risk of not recovering those costs and then damage our balance sheet when we're trying to help the markets.
So just one additional kind of thought on that. I mean, I think going back to the last point that you just made about what's fair to who's going to bear those costs. Is it going to be the LDC, the gas end use customer versus electric customers? And I think when you start thinking about those questions, what are we really doing in the long term from a public policy perspective? Gas infrastructure is 40, 50, 60, 70 years. It's a massive, massive expenditure that, have we really taken a hard enough look to look at leakage rates on the distribution system? There's some studies that have shown even during the polar vortex, you had the bulk system for gas at 80, 85%. So it wasn't an issue of, so I mean, I think without getting into the question, I think from our perspective, we need to be maxing out gas and electric efficiency first. We need to be maximizing the use of existing infrastructure before we even talk about expanding this infrastructure, because the other piece that's relevant to this is, with the EPA Clean Power Plan, we've got a 2030 reduction target. If we just chase a dispatch away from coal to gas and build out trillions of dollars of gas pipeline and then get to 2030 and we've still got 50% reduction to get to by 2050, what have we done?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to that is, in New England especially, there's a huge gas constraint. That gas constraint has increased electric costs on the order of $3 to $5 billion a year for the last couple of years. A gas pipeline can relieve that constraint for $2.5 to $3 billion and bring energy costs down. So even if it's just a bridge solution until you can get to the renewables, it should still be considered. I mean, it's not trillions of dollars, but the capacity costs and the recovery from customers for the capacity of that pipeline would be more than outweighed by the benefit that we would see in the commodity costs coming down to both gas LDCs and to the electric generators. It's a question of how you can get that paid for. Right.
I had a question, maybe a little bit provocative, but the topic of this afternoon is how we reconcile the state public policy initiatives and goals with wholesale competitive markets. And as a single state ISO, New York has options that would be harder to do in a multi-state ISO. And would you consider something that tried to price the environmental attributes, whether it's carbon or whatever, into the market, in some sort of I don't want to say like CARB, but some kind of so then you could have your wholesale market still solve for the economic, and you could price in whatever the environmental attributes are through a carbon trading or whatever. You have options as a state that you don't have to bring 13 other states along. I just don't know if that, it seems like it would be elegantly solve some of the problems. I'm sure it would perhaps create others, but is that something because Mr. Morris made the comment that RGGI would be great, but it sets too low a price on carbon, so it doesn't make the things that you want the solution to solve for come with the solution you want, because it still undervalues the environmental externalities that you feel are there, which is why you're reaching for those other solutions. I just don't know if anyone wants to touch that, but whether that would be you know, I think what under 111D we'll see states do different things, but I don't, you know, I don't have a crystal ball what they might be.
So since it's my fault, I guess I have to answer.
No,
you know, I think first of all, you know, even though New York is a one-state RTO, you know, I do think of the way the energy markets work as part, you know, we're nested within ISO New England and PJM and Ontario and all of those, you know, we're not an island. Even though from a regulatory perspective, we are unique.
We're on an island today, but the rest of the state is
right. So, I mean, I think you know, my hope is that as states within the RGGI footprint, and in Pennsylvania with a new governor, and in Virginia, and in other parts of the country, as they grapple with how do we meet these obligations under 111D, that you're going to see a logical progression towards regional approaches, and that you know, I won't say, you know, whether we support New York going it alone or coming up with some sort of approach.
I wasn't advocating that. I was just asking, is there a market way to...
Right, and I think in my mind a better discussion is to look at the fact that you have RGGI as a great starting point for integrating the cost of an externality into the markets fairly seamlessly. It's essentially a fuel cost. That's helpful from an RTO dispatch perspective. It's also helpful from an asset owner perspective. And so to the extent we can make sure that that number is actually reflective of the environmental impacts that carbon has, and that other markets can identify that as well, and other states can come along, I think that's ultimately where we would want to head. And I know I didn't totally answer your question, but that's the best I can do.
I would just note two things about it. One is, if we do it solely in New York, well, I'm not an economist, I'm an attorney. Some very smart economists that I know have taught me about this concept called liquidity. Right. And if you just need a set amount in New York, I'm not sure you can ever create a market, because there's not going to be enough demand. It's just going to be, you're only going to put out there exactly what's needed. And unless we're going to start putting out a lot more for the arbitrage opportunities, which to me is just going to drive up costs, I don't know that it's achievable. And I agree with Jackson, it really needs to be done at a regional level. When RGGI was created, one of the very big issues was what they called leakage, which was the potential for folks to go to other states because they don't have that RGGI cost. New York, it was acknowledged earlier, already has some of the highest costs in the country. And from a consumer perspective and from the city's perspective, we would be very concerned about increasing costs to the point that no one else around us has, because that's just going to flow business and people out of New York to lower cost areas.
So is the question, and this gets back to, you know, what the public policy type approach. I mean, one way is to sort of put a price on carbon and then internalize it into the economic dispatch of the market. Another way would be to generate demand by imposing a clean energy, like we do with RPS, obligation on load-serving entities, so that regardless of whether you're a utility or an ESCO, you have an obligation to procure a certain amount of clean energy. You generate the demand that way, and then it gets priced in the market. What you're doing is you're not changing the wholesale price, you're just affecting the fuel mix simply by saying, if you're going to operate in New York, we want 30%, 40% to come from carbon, zero carbon resources. And then, which is, I know, something that Illinois, I think, is looking at. And I think, you know, maybe these are the kind of, from my perspective going forward, we need to start playing with these ideas, because even, I think while it's going to be easier to do these things in New York from the standpoint as a single state ISO, I think it's going to hit all the states. How are we, particularly as the restructured states, for the same reason we're talking about the pipeline, absent an integrated utility where the state regulator says thou shalt buy this, this, and this, then we need to figure out what's the procurement mechanism. And we as a state, of course, should be thinking about how do we make sure that procurement mechanism is uniform across all consumers, so we don't have a have and have not situation.
But if you do it through a souped up RPS, that does, I mean, not that I want to have the conversation again, that does get back into how do those, whatever it is you're requiring them to buy, bid in the wholesale market. I mean, I think to Mr. Lang's point, if we believe that there's something in the environmental public policy assets you want to procure that's not priced in the market because they're not least cost, you are price into your consumers, maybe not as visibly as a carbon tax that might have more, look pricier, but I mean, you're still saying we're buying something because it's not cheaper, even though it's not cheaper because we want something else. So there is still some price, right?
I think this, with Norman's comment, this is really where the Federal Power Act stretches all our brains. Because it really is a question, stretches all our brains. I mean, least cost in 1935 was the lowest cost resource to meet demand. If we're moving to a circumstance where, in fact, through the EPA, states now have an obligation to have a certain amount of clean energy in their mix, least cost has got to be the resources that meet the clean energy mix. And if we start, if not, then we have this huge conflict between two federal policies, and somehow they need to be reconciled, I think, in the demand generation for the resource. That's, go ahead.
And I was just going to say, going back to the comparability discussion about, wholesale, retail assets. I think it really is important to point out, we hope to see under the REV a proliferation of zero emissions resources, storage, solar, all the rest. At the same time, it's critical to recognize that RGGI stops at 25 megawatts. And so if we are going to see a system that at the wholesale level has become increasingly clean and cleaner, which is a huge testament to the work that policymakers have done in New York, what are we going to ensure that at that distributed system level we're not exposing ourselves to a perverse outcome where we have a bunch of reciprocating engines on the top of buildings and environmental justice communities because we didn't apply the same stringency to the distributed world as we have begun to apply appropriately at the wholesale level. So it's just, I think it goes both ways, and it's just really important to recognize that.
Well, my brain does feel stretchy, so, yeah.
I think the other issue that the utilities have with one of the constructs that Chair Zilliman just mentioned, we're I won't say opposed, but it's not in our best interest, in a customer's best interest necessarily, to enter into long-term power agreements with wind developers or other renewable developers. As we said before, others have said, it's really taking the risk of the generator bidding into the wholesale competitive markets, taking that risk off the generator and putting it on the utilities and its customers to meet those obligations. To me, paying an attribute for those renewable benefits that the state and the federal government are looking for, as opposed to paying a carbon tax on those that are emitting. So it's just two different sides of a coin, right? You can either tax the generators that are emitting emissions, or you can pay generators for the attributes that avoid that. And if you can get those kind of constructs into the market, then we could potentially avoid the need for long-term power purchase contracts to get those built, because there's just not enough money in the market to get financing for those renewable generators.
So if we did something like that and imposed essentially the obligation on the New York ISO to create a mix or do a dispatch protocol differently, could we go there? I mean, that's, to me, this is really, I mean, I think this is a discussion we're going to be having a lot as we try to figure out how to go from, how to take the EPA mandate, which is a state compliance mandate, is the same question, and place it on states that have restructured.
Well, I think that is definitely going to be a discussion that 111D is going to be forcing, because at least 2 of the 4 building blocks relate to states choosing to use resources differently. And so then how do the regional markets solve for that in their algorithm is definitely something that, but we haven't talked about 111D much today. That's not driving your
I think that the no, I mean, obviously, that from our perspective, the public policy is there. The state is committed to a clean energy mix.
But I mean,
111D just further, you know, places some, I would say, need to make sure we get there.
But I think also just highlights one of the attractions of a mass-based, regional, market-based approach like RGGI is that once you set that cap, you're demonstrating compliance by a declining cap. And so your renewables and efficiency programs are still essential, and you need to do monitoring and verification to ensure you're wisely investing dollars. But at the same time, you don't necessarily have to track that megawatt hour of efficiency or wind. You don't have to make Steve environmentally dispatch the system, because you've got a price on carbon that is delivering, and the cap is demonstrating compliance, not a parallel dispatch system that you're tinkering with because you're building it.
Now we've come full circle, because that's
Right.
what I asked a couple of minutes ago. Wouldn't it be better to just price it in and then let the, in a perfect world?
Right, if we have the perfect price and perfect information.
I would say if you can't do it that way, move it to the distribution level and get it out of the wholesale markets.
One...
And I say that for complete self-interest, because when the letters about price start flying, I would rather not have it be about a capacity zone. I would much rather have it be about a utilities distribution zone.
Yeah, there you go.
Then we can make Audrey's brain hurt.
And I just, I'll take off my distributed generation hat and put on my energy efficiency hat. I think there's real value for energy efficiency, even though, our experience in New England is that almost all of the energy efficiency bid into the market is bidden by the load-serving entities through their programs. But there are a couple of things that happen. One is they have to put up surety. They have to commit to being there 3 years in advance. They have to be measured just like everybody else, and they are accountable. And so it does make us, makes energy efficiency kind of, step up and be more rigorous, more transparent, more robust, and more consistent in EM&V across the different utilities. But I think that's served us well. And so I think there's real value in that, and being able to play in a comparable way has brought value in terms of better EM&V and better performance in meeting those obligations.
Yeah, I have a question for John Reese, just because I can.
Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Forward capacity markets, looking out, I think we've heard 5 years, 3 years, 1 year, 6 months. As a generator deciding, somebody that just reopened plants, what are the benefits and the risks associated with longer-term markets? In other words, I know you put money into it, and I assume that it was based on what your expected revenue is over the few years, but are there circumstances where having to commit 3 years out might actually discourage you from, maybe Scott could address this too, are there circumstances where having to commit 3 years out might actually discourage investment because it's the uncertainty associated with it?
There's certainly some downside. Look, I am a strong proponent of a long-term market. As somebody with 2 development projects with existing locations to repower and units that are old and marginal, how we get to build new, how we get those investments is one of my primary objectives. So I want a 7-year a 3-year forward market and a 7-year lockup, because I've talked to debt, I've talked to equity. I can finance a project on that based on that, and I can't without it. As I look at bringing a unit back, a 3-year ahead on the unit we brought back, we would bring it back. The risk for me, having older units, is that something could happen in one of the existing units in the next 3 years. They're old. We put a lot of money into maintenance.
They're almost as old as you, right?
In fact, I actually, there's one that's almost my age, yes. And so, we look at that, we consider that, and it certainly would judge what we bid into the market, but it also would be an incentive for replacement. It is another reason why I would want to take out an aging peaker and replace it with something that has a 40% reduction in carbon value given heat rate efficiencies. But today, based on gas prices and a 1-month effective capacity price, I can't.
Well, I'm sure everybody would like a 7-year contract or a 10-year contract, but I think we got into restructuring because we didn't want the consumers to have to bear the risk of those long-term contracts. And power plants are getting built without long-term contracts, and you have to make a decision. Do we want to take on that risk? And if we write a contract for 7 years or 5 years or 10 years for the new plant, what it means is that uplift cost, because there's an uplift cost, the difference between what that person gets paid in the future and the market going price is going to get allocated to the other load-serving entities, including the ones like maybe Marge's Direct Energy that contracted bilaterally on their own. And then they're going to have to eat some of the cost of the centrally procured capacity.
You're making an assumption that the prices are going to be higher in the long-term contract.
Well, he wouldn't be interested in it if he thought it was.
Well, we don't know.
You know, actually, part of it is fixing the price. Now, we've been through a number of refinancing over time. We've looked at financing projects. S&P have done a couple specials on us. Regulatory uncertainty is the biggest risk that we have. And if you can take me out of the regulatory uncertainty that is New York, you know, I live here, I know what it's like, there's a value to that. And that's a real value when it comes to dealing with both equity investors and debt investors.
And that's a real value to John, but it's not a value to consumers because he's not going to be setting the market price now, someone else is. So he's getting that certainty and we're still paying higher costs. You're also not helping a market because now he's locked in. He doesn't care about what goes on in the market for that period of time of the lock-in. So while it certainly helps John, and I appreciate that, and to a certain extent, from the city's perspective, you know, repowering to us is a very important issue. We have a lot of old plants that are, let's just call them less efficient than what a modern plant is. But the market rules that exist today do not, and I agree with John on this, they do not provide any reason for him to repower his facilities or any of the other New York City generators. That to us is a market deficiency that needs to be corrected. We tried to do that through the NISO process. We appreciate the help we got from the NISO, but we weren't able to achieve it. But it's a very important issue to us from not just an environmental standpoint, but from a market standpoint and even from a fuel use standpoint. A modern plant is going to use less fuel to produce the same BTUs as his older facilities. And as gas gets tighter, we have lots of shale gas, but we have supply issues. And in New York City in particular, the issue isn't so much upstream capacity, it's the capacity within the city system. The reason we have minimum oil burn requirements in parts of New York City isn't because of upstream supply, it's because of the capacity of the gas system within New York City. So we need to address those issues. I don't know that we're ever going to address the in-city gas supply issues because the costs are so massive, but we should be able to address the issues that remove the disincentives, whether it's John's plants or the other in-city generators, from stepping up as good corporate citizens and repowering their facilities with things that are more efficient and lower cost for all of us.
Isn't the problem, though, I mean, it's a fundamental market size issue. So, I mean, if you have a capacity price and we take a unit out, right, capacity prices go up, right, and then the unit comes back in and the capacity prices drop. If John is replacing, let's say, a peaking unit that only operates a couple hours, is only there for the capacity, not for the energy, and he doesn't spend a lot of time, not that you would ever do this, but you don't spend a lot of money maintaining it, there's no real incentive to take a lot of investment risk, put in a new plant, and get the same capacity. You might as well just run your existing plant as long as you can, right?
Sure.
I mean, economically for existing unit owners, I would think their risk is not, they're never going to repower. What their risk is somebody else comes in and then their plant becomes somewhat irrelevant.
Well, but if we're talking about we're going to build a new unit and never run it, that would be hopelessly uneconomic.
No.
But I think the point is that if you built a new unit, you'd actually build it so it'd be much more efficient than some of your competitors' units. So you wouldn't be building a unit that would only run 2 hours. You'd be building a unit that ran 3,000
But I
hours
get-
or
I get your
8,000
point.
hours.
You
And-
would want that unit, though, to be able to collect enough in
And-
energy payments to make up
Right.
for the fact that...
And the incentive on the new units are actually, I mean, on the existing units are actually multiple to replace them. One is, my least efficient units run 2/3 of the time off-peak. They have nothing to do with peak. My units run most often for system reliability throughout the Con Ed system. And so I have to be always prepared for operation, because I am more likely to be called this evening than I am on the peak July day, or certainly as likely. And so those units, all of my compensation are driven. When you only run 100 hours, you can't be forced out because your capacity revenues will die. So you have an incentive to keep those units running as efficiently as possible, and knowing that, yes, somebody else can come in and replace that unit with something else, and you're competing against who else will come in. But there's the third item, and that is the life of the units, that eventually the units need to be replaced. There's just no question about it. And what you want is a system that allows you to replace the units and not penalize you for that replacement.
Yeah, I would just also go to the argument, and even some of these smart economists I know disagree on it, is New York City even a market? We have such tremendous mitigation measures on both the buyer side and the seller side, because it is a very constrained area. There's very limited transmission that goes into it. You're not going to build a lot of new generation to compete with each other because there's just not the space available. And maybe it is a special case, probably is, but perhaps the one-size-fits-all approach that we've been going by doesn't necessarily work in the New York City marketplace. And I agree with John. I think some of the New York City units, and I want to identify which ones, are getting to the point when you look at the average lifespan of a generating facility, some are there or past there, and certainly we have seen with USPG, and not that they did anything wrong, but units will have greater problems as they get older, just a nature of their age and material fatigue and things like that. We need to have the right process in place that provides, I won't call it a price signal or a market signal, but the right incentives for these generators to do the right thing and to replace those facilities. And the system we have right now says to them, keep that old generator in place as long as you possibly can, because even if you do a megawatt for megawatt replacement of that facility, you have absolutely no likelihood that that new facility is going to be able to compete. And to us, that is not the right price, the right signal we should be sending to these folks.
I would, as usually, respectfully disagree with Kevin. I think that actually Margie's former employer bringing in the Bayonne unit is an example of someone who actually did. They had a special situation. They were able to do it without price certainty for 5 or 7 years. That was kind of unique, but the fact that the capacity prices in New York were where they were allowed them to do that. And you know what? They passed mitigation. In fact, in New York, the non-subsidized, non-government contract units are the ones that have passed the mitigation measures.
I don't want to debate.
We'll go on.
I don't want to debate that issue, but I look at how many new plants came into New York, and most of them have come in not on the same way that Bayonne did.
Yeah, Bayonne was the jet engines. Is that the?
Over in
in New Jersey.
I mean, in effect, then we're circling back, I think, to the issue of mitigation and what do we need to do to incent.
Let me take it in another direction that relates to something else the Commission's talked about and that bears on these incentives. And, you know, the issue of uplift is relevant here, because when John talks about if you have a unit that's put on every day and always runs at minimum load and is never economic in the market because you aren't pricing the New York City reserve constraint or something, then it gets reimbursed its costs. And it doesn't matter whether its costs are $50 a megawatt or $100 a megawatt, it gets reimbursed its costs. So it actually has no incentive to reduce its costs because it's going to be uneconomic and it's just going to get paid. So to the extent when you have constraints that aren't priced that result in units being committed out of merit, you got to realize if it's a unit that happens just once in a while, it isn't a big deal. But if it's chronic, it does mean that there's no return to reducing the cost of that unit, because every dollar you reduce your cost, your uplift payments go down $1. So to the extent we can we've got constraints like that that force units to be on, they'll have a more powerful incentive to improve their performance if they, if that's priced in the market so that they look at their economics differently.
This is exactly why we're looking at uplift, but it sounds almost unimpeachable, put more of the prices into the market. That means market prices going up, though, to send the right signals, which only is long until those signals are responded to. And
so we're actually at the end of our time. So first of all, I want to thank all the panelists. I was a little worried, the after-lunch panel, are we going to be able to generate that same type of energy? But guys did a great job, so thank you. And I appreciate, as always, I appreciate the John and Kevin show. So
we're taking it on the road.
But so one, I'll just take a couple minutes and then turn it over to chair the floor. So from my perspective, what we've heard, and we'll certainly take this back and think about what is it, what can we suggest, what can we improve going forward. I think that the largest takeaway for me every time I'm in these discussions is that we always want to say that the market's the thing, but unfortunately I don't think we can say within this sector we have pure markets. I mean, as we're saying essentially, and I can sort of channel Bill Hogan, I mean, the capacity markets are an administrative construct. They're not a true market. They're full of subsidies. If some people's subsidies or other people's equity. But as a matter of fact, though, I think we are entering into a new era. A new era maybe colored by certainly 111D is one aspect, but from the state's perspective, it's a recognition that there's an awful lot of innovation that's occurring at the distribution level. There's an awful lot of innovation that's occurring even on the grid itself. And that the markets were designed at a period of time where the focus was on generation and incenting innovation on traditional supply without thought of what could happen in other technologies, other capabilities. And I would end in just saying I don't see this as a flaw in the market design, but would become a flaw if we failed to recognize these changes need to be and should be accommodated to hit our obligation. And our goal is to getting the markets working to procure the resources that are at lowest cost and meeting various objectives that we have going forward and opportunities. So with respective of for me, I think that there's so much information we've gotten out of these conversations. They've been very rich. They've been certainly thought-provoking. I would certainly suggest, Chair LaFleur, that we would want to take this back, think about it, and then maybe get back together and start thinking about what could be some next steps as we move forward on both sides, the distribution side and the wholesale side.
Well, I think that definitely makes sense. I think I started the day by saying we're stress testing our competitive markets with all of the new resources coming in, and we really saw that acutely this afternoon with the new technologies and opportunities on the customer level and how those are creating a tension with some of the market constructs. And I think we are all committed to the value of trying to do what's right for customers in terms of a reliable supply that with the environmental attributes that customers want and at the least cost. And what I think has been good about the discussion is we've been pretty honest and open-eyed about the trade-offs to get there, because sometimes there's a tendency to not even acknowledge that there are trade-offs or that some of these things are in tension. I think we have to go back, talk to our smart staffs, and think about opportunities on the things we talked about, but we also have a number of things pending before us in real time. These things, it's not like we just hop from tech conference to tech conference. All the cases we do in between this informs that discussion as well. I just want to take another opportunity to thank. I can look out at some of the many folks at FERC, and I know there's a lot of folks from the PSC. It doesn't just happen to have tech conference where you bring several dozen people to out of town for both of you when you have protesters outside and pull it together seamlessly. So, and they did all of that work. So thank you.
I really don't have much to add. FERC clearly shares a very similar goal with the New York Public Service Commission. Like the PSC, we want energy to be sustainable, reliable, and at just and reasonable rates. And FERC constantly engages in an assessment of its markets and looks for ways to improve them. And so I think this conversation today has been very helpful in terms of getting views from any number of panelists and from the New York Public Service Commission in terms of their views of the New York ISO. One topic that came up today is the elimination of barriers to entry to the market. That is something that FERC has been very focused on over the last few years, whether it involves generator interconnection, whether it involves market-based rates for ancillary services or the like. So that work is always going to continue at FERC. I think one takeaway for me from this meeting today was the importance of having this meeting with the New York Public Service Commission and getting their views on some of the issues and challenges that they're facing. So I appreciate, again, and want to thank you again for hosting us for this conference.
Thank you.
I just once again thank the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission commissioners and staff for coming to New York. I thought it was extremely useful. And just to parrot what Audrey's been saying, I think we really are at a sea change here. This whole system, the whole markets were designed about the old hub and spoke system, the unidirectional power plants, big power plants, far away from loads, moving the power from one end to the other. We designed the markets because that was the reality of what existed in the mid-90s when these markets were designed. We're really starting to see the technological change. Some of it's happening, some of it's about to happen, some of it we can't even predict what's going to happen. But we need to take a look at those markets and say, does all the systems that we designed work in the new paradigm? Audrey's leadership, we're doing that at the state level. We're really trying to take a hard look at our own retail regulatory structure and say, does that work under the new paradigm? And I think this is a tremendous opportunity to work with you folks as we develop that to say, okay, how do the wholesale rules now either conflict or complement what's going on, and are there needs for changes? So thank you. Hopefully this is a start of a dialogue.
Thank you very much. I thought this was very informative and helpful. I just want to say, I don't think the markets are the problem. And I think that when we look at this, I think that we're all sort of on the same page of it's still an open question of how do we achieve our public policy goals, and how do we do that. And I know this will sound a little wacky, but from studying last night with my son with science, to me it's like, are you looking at, you know, the plate tectonic theory where you're doing pulling them apart, pushing them together, or side by side. And I like to think that the side by side, which I hope you got right what the answer was because I forget, but the side by side is really what we're trying to do, and that means that there is some tension in this. So what I just want to make sure is that we don't sort of have a takeaway that there is a problem with the markets. Actually, there's a societal value to the markets. So that is part of the public policy goal that we need to keep in mind. And so I just think that the leadership of the two chairs is very important, as well as Steve Whitley at the ISO, because ultimately we all have to figure out this tension that we have and come up with the right solution for the long term, but also not insert ourselves unintentionally in what we already have as a threshold, that the markets which are here, and they may have not, they may need to evolve to certain degrees, does not mean that we need to throw out everything. So that's, you know, that's just sort of my perspective in looking at that and getting to it, and I think there's a lot of different opinions on how to get to there. So thank you very much.
Just briefly, thank everybody who participated today. Cheryl and your colleagues, we really appreciate you coming today. And again, as this started out, it's always about communication and dialogue, which is really important. And certainly our panelists that participated today gave us great insight and information, and we really appreciate you coming. And to everybody out there in the audience, really, this was a great turnout, and I think, Audrey, you've started something.
I'd like to add my thanks to FERC and the joint staffs. And from my background in telecommunications, I'd like to urge everybody to just kind of keep an eye on the sky. When I started with telecom, it was all about voice and making long-distance calls by dialing telephones. And then technology came down the road, and these killer apps, which were more hindered than helped by regulation, called cellular and broadband, came down the road and completely changed the landscape of the industry. I don't know if there's something like that coming for energy, but I think we ought to keep looking over our shoulder, and if it is, let it come.
Thank you. I would be remiss also in saying that the staff did a great job, not just today, but I know in preparing the questions and the back and forth. So thank you for that. Also, I want to acknowledge we actually have other former commissioners in the audience. Commissioner Kelly is here from FERC. We have, I saw Bob Curry was here from the New York PSC, and Scott Wiener from the New Jersey
Chairman
BPU.
Flynn was here too, but
he may have been.
He registered.
We don't know. Somewhere in New York. Well, thank you all, and again, appreciate your attendance and attention, and it was a great day, so thank you.
Thank you.